Hi and welcome back. Today we're going to look at the Cubase 10 channel EQ. If you've watched a few of my other videos, you probably think of me as a Reaper user, but that wasn't always the case. Indeed, Reaper didn't exist when I started out. In fact, I started with a MIDI-only version of Cubase that ran on an Atari ST, and which I used mostly to automate a primitive digital mixer. Later on, I had a day job programming MIDI files, using a version of Cubase that required this dongle, which I still have in a drawer somewhere. I don't seem to have the brain capacity to stay expert on more than one DAW at a time, however, and these days I work mostly in Reaper, for reasons I might explore in another video. But every time I come back to Cubase, I find stuff I really like these stock EQs with little graphs integrated into the mixer. If I click on one, it pops up a larger display, so I can tweak the EQ for that channel. And this workflow feels a lot like operating a hardware digital console. The biggest advantage that stock EQs have over third-party plugins is the potential to integrate them into the interface and improve the workflow. Cubase, and indeed Ableton Live, both do this well in their own different ways. But it's fair to say that Reaper doesn't. Using Re-EQ has no workflow advantages over using any other EQ plugin. Anyway, these are great for quick tweaks. But for detailed work on the drum bus, I'd like a larger interface. So let's pop up the channel settings. There are a couple of EQ displays here. Amazingly, this tiny one is actually tweakable. But I can't imagine ever wanting to work like that, so let's switch to the equalizer tab instead. And that's much better. So let's suck out some mid-range. I can adjust the Q with my mouse wheel, which is good. I can also double-click to add a band, FabFilter style, which is also good. And similarly, if I double-click over to the left, it enables the low shelf in band 1. If I adjust the mouse wheel, I can add a pre-rise dip to this shelf response, which is nice. This type of shape can be very useful. But there are other shelf types available. This is low shelf 2. Let's try low shelf 1. And the result is very different. Notice that the Q parameter doesn't make any difference now. So let's try low shelf 3. And this time the Q parameter adds a resonant bump just below the target frequency. Okay, let's try low shelf 4. And now high Q settings add both a bump and a dip. This setting is closest in appearance to the shelves in Pro-Q3. I'm going to go with low shelf 2, so I can suck out a bit of the bass region while I simultaneously add low weight to the kick. One criticism is I can't find any way to change the vertical scale of this display. With plus or minus 24 dB of range available, subtle changes can get a bit fiddly. Okay, if I double click over to the right, I can enable the high shelf. And once again, this defaults to shelf type 2. With a high Q setting, this gives a pre-dip rise when cutting. Again, often a useful type of response. Notice there's no sign of any cramping. You can do a proper Baxendale style boost right up at 20 kHz. To which I say, well done Steinberg. This is the first stock EQ I've found so far that is de-cramped by default with zero latency. That bypass button could be more obvious, but I'm picking nits now. So I have to say, it's nice to use and it sounds good. Perhaps the only real criticism I can find is that it only has 4 bands available. I know you'll say to me that hardware consoles only have 4 bands typically. But if I had £1 for every time I'd wished for another EQ band when using a hardware console, well, I'd probably go and buy another guitar. Hardware consoles have hardware limitations, of course, which don't exist in software. So I'd say don't be stingy, Steinberg. Give us another couple of bands at least. Okay, so it's probably time for the pink noise test. I've got identical clips of pink noise on track 1 and track 2, with the FabFilter EQ inserted on track 2 as my reference. And I've flipped the polarity on track 1 so that when I turn them both on together, they null. We can see the combined difference signal on a spectrum analyzer. Let's start with a high-pass filter. There's only a frequency parameter available, much like most consoles, so I'll set that to 100 Hz. And let's have a matching high-pass filter in Pro-Q3. Frequency set to 100 Hz, default Q of 1. And it doesn't quite null perfectly. Let's try tuning the Q parameter in Pro-Q3. That's the wrong way. And there we go. 1.049 gives us a perfect null. That was easy. So let's try a low shelf. Plus 12 dB. I'll stick with 100 Hz and the default Q setting of 1. Now I'll do the same in Pro-Q3. Let's drag in a low shelf. Set it to 100 Hz, 12 dB of boost. The default Q setting is nowhere near a null. Let's try tweaking that. Notice that I'm not adjusting the Q parameter in the Cubase EQ. Turning this up with shelf types 2 and 3 will produce shapes that you can't recreate in Pro-Q3 with a single band. So I'm going to leave this at the default so we have a better chance of achieving a good null, and just try to adjust Pro-Q3 to match. And this seems to be about as good as it gets. Okay, let's switch from the default shelf type 2 and try type 1 instead. Nowhere near a null with this one. Out of interest, let's try switching to the 6 dB slope in Pro-Q3. The Q control is greyed out with this slope, in much the same way that the equivalent parameter in the Cubase EQ does nothing. But no, we're still not nulling. Interestingly, if I adjust the frequency in Pro-Q3, I can do a lot better. In fact, the best null I've found against the shelf type 1 in Cubase is to use the 6 dB shelf slope and adjust the frequency by quite a lot. This is almost an octave lower than the Cubase low shelf parameter. Okay, let's go back to 100 Hz and a 12 dB slope. And let's try low shelf type 3 in Cubase. Again, that's about as good as the null gets. Okay, how about low shelf type 4? That's a bit better already. Ooh, nearly. Perhaps if I persevered with my fine-tuning of the Q, I could get this to drop off the graph entirely. But anyway, that's good enough for me. I can't believe that this amount of difference would ever be audible. So, as I predicted from looking at the shapes of the curves, low shelf type 4 in Cubase is closest in behaviour to the 12 dB Pro-Q3 low shelf. Okay, let's try a parametric midband. Here's plus 12 dB of boost, 1 kHz, with the default Q setting of 1. And I can null this perfectly against a parametric band in Pro-Q3. However, I've had to set the Q parameter to precisely 1.211 to achieve this null. So the Q value in Pro-Q3 differs from that in the Cubase EQ. But once you've compensated for that, the differences disappear. However, we again have a choice of types. The default is type 2, so let's try type 1 instead. The bell clearly gets a lot wider, so let's widen the band in Pro-Q3 to compensate. And the best null is now round about there. But this time I can't get a perfect null. I can get the low end to cancel perfectly. But the high frequencies are a bit different, whatever I do with the Q setting. So what if I shift these bands higher? Let's try 10 kHz. And there's much less of a null now. Interestingly, this Cubase bell shape looks a bit more cramped than the Pro-Q3 bell. Let's see if I can match them better. And I can't really get a better null than that. There's clearly audible difference concentrated in the higher frequencies. So what about type 2? This looks more symmetrical and less cramped to me. Anyway, let's try a Q of 1.211 in Pro-Q3, which nulled perfectly at 1 kHz. It's not nulling now, but it is a lot closer than type 1. That's about as good as I can get. Out of interest, let's try going higher, right up to 20K. And in practice, I'm getting a better null here. As the majority of the difference is above the cutoff frequency, it's now too high to make any difference at all. And the two EQs can do quite similar Baxandall style boosts. Let's try type 1. Much less of a null now, even once I've adjusted the Q. But notice that as the difference is concentrated right at the very highest frequencies that we're less sensitive to, it actually sounds quieter than the same test at 10 kHz. Nevertheless, it's still much more difference than we saw with parametric type 2. Let's analyse this a little closer. A bit of loopback routing in my interface allows me to patch in Plugin Doctor in external hardware mode, so we can examine the differences in more detail. Here I've zoomed in to show the high frequencies, with Pro-Q3 shown in blue. Notice that I can match the lower half of the curve better than the upper half. But overall, they're very similar. Likewise, if I analyse the phase response, there are some subtle differences. But notice that both EQs have a slight phase shift at the target frequency of 10 kHz. Technically, this frequency should be at 0 phase. This tiny bit of phase shift seems to be the price you pay for a de-cramped frequency response with no latency. So let's see how Cubase's Type 1 band compares to Type 2. I can match the lower half of the curve pretty well, but the upper half of the blue Type 1 curve plunges back to unity in a manner typical of standard cramping digital EQs. Looking at the phase response, we see that both hit 0 at the Nyquist limit. But the blue Type 1 curve passes through 0 phase at 10 kHz, and the upper half is narrower than the lower half. While the purple Type 2 curve remains symmetrical, but with a slight overall shift, so the target frequency is not at 0 phase. These differences are even more obvious up at 20 kHz. Here's the frequency response, with the same Q settings as before for both EQs. Notice the lower half of the curves are still close, though not exactly matched anymore. But the upper halves are now dramatically different. There's no mistaking that plunge back to 0 in the blue Type 1 curve. And here's how the phase looks. That blue Type 1 curve isn't even close to being symmetrical anymore, while the purple Type 2 curve has just shifted down some more, with the target frequency drifting a little further from 0 phase. I can guess what's going on here. Let's load up the standalone version of Re-EQ. While Re-EQ has much to recommend it, it exhibits classic cramping behaviour. If you dial in a gentle mid-boost, then sweep it up to 20 kHz or thereabouts, that gentle boost becomes a narrow, asymmetric spike. Now, I established in my Re-EQ video that if you compensated the Q or the bandwidth to match the lower half of the curve to the analog model, this goes much more than halfway to fixing the problem, as we're much more sensitive to these lower frequencies and much more likely to hear slight differences in that region. The Cubase Type 1 parametric band behaves slightly differently. If I sweep a band up towards Nyquist, we can see that it doesn't turn into a spike at all. In fact, the lower half of the curve stays fairly consistent in shape, and we only see the cramping affecting the top half of the curve. So it seems to me that the Type 1 parametric band in the Cubase EQ is actually just a standard digital EQ with a cramped response. But the Q parameter is compensated behind the scenes to correct the shape for the lower half of the curve. Essentially, it automatically makes the corrections that I made manually in my Re-EQ video. This makes it feel much more like an analog EQ in use, but it's definitely not as good as Type 2's approach, which seems to be properly de-cramped in much the same way as the FabFilter EQ. So let's tweak the bandwidth in Re-EQ and see if I can prove my theory with a null. We're getting pretty close now. I might have to type in fractional values. But there it is. There's the null. So, notwithstanding the internal correction of the Q, Type 1 is a standard cramping digital EQ. I'm guessing that parametric type 1 is actually a legacy mode, to recreate the response of an EQ from an earlier version of Cubase, while type 2 is a newer addition. This would also fit with the decision to make type 2 the default mode for a new channel, and I'll speculate that the same might apply to the type 1 shelves. But of course I could be wrong. Speaking of the shelves, let's try a high shelf. Let's go for plus 12 dB, default setting of 12K, Q at 1. Let's replicate that in Pro-Q3. 12 kHz, plus 12 dB, and let's tune the Q. That seems to be the best we can do. The difference signal is quite large, but it sounds like a good null because most of that difference is concentrated in the very highest frequencies that we're less sensitive to. Let's try high shelf 1. Much bigger difference now. I can't tune that out at all. High shelf 3. Again, that's about as good as it gets. And high shelf 4. That's better immediately. I can sweep that notch around. Sweeping it lower probably makes for less audible differences in practice. But I still can't get anything like a perfect null. So this leaves me with a dilemma: how to set up a meaningful listening test. The Cubase EQ provides option for shelving shapes that can't be recreated in Pro-Q3 with a single band. But on the other hand, you can easily recreate these shapes in Pro-Q3 by using multiple bands. This also gives you much more control over the overall shape. And Pro-Q3 allows you to select multiple bands and adjust them all together, so you can still work just as quickly. So here's what we'll do. Here's the drums from the start of the video. This instance of Pro-Q3 is processing the raw drum mix, but the EQ'd version is routed to the sidechain, so I can use the EQ match function to analyze what Cubase's EQ did, and try to recreate the same frequency response in Pro-Q3. This means Pro-Q3 can use multiple bands to try to recreate the Type 2 shelves I used. And it can even switch to different slope settings if it thinks they fit better. I realise it's not a perfect test. It's as much a test of Pro-Q3's EQ match function as it is a valid comparison of the EQs. But what the hell, let's do it anyway. Okay, these have settled down now. Let's click match, and I'll go for 8 bands. And the result is quite interesting, and not really what I expected at all. Most of the bands are using steeper slopes, such as 24 or 36 dB per octave. And the resulting response is quite complex. But of course, what really matters is how it sounds. Which do you think is which? So A was the FabFilter plugin. Did you get it right? Now, my use of the EQ match feature in Pro-Q3 kind of highlights the extra features that are available in Pro-Q3. No stock EQ plugin can match the feature set on offer here. From comprehensive stereo processing options, to dynamic EQ, to linear phase or natural phase modes. But that's not really been my focus for these EQ shootout videos. I'm more interested in the basic sound quality, and concerns people may have that using the stock EQ is adversely affecting their mixes. In this case, I can assure you that it isn't. It's not the same as the FabFilter plugin, but it's remarkably similar in behaviour to the FabFilter Zero Latency mode. If one is objectively better than the other in some way, it's beyond my skill levels to determine which. The Cubase EQ doesn't have enough bands, still my only real criticism. But the extra shapes available for the shelving bands help to mitigate that to a degree. Overall, I have to say I'm quite impressed. Bravo Steinberg. And that's all for now. Thanks for watching.